All right, it's 5 minutes past here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Ryan Pappal. I'm a current PGY1 at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, and also a current off-going resident member at large on the RAMS board. I'm pleased to join you this afternoon for a discussion on the evolving landscape of resident unionization. We have no disclosures. I'm going to go ahead and leave this up while I do an introductory component. There are also some printed copies of this QR code. You can submit questions at any time during this presentation anonymously, and we're happy to get to them toward the end. While I make a few introductory remarks, feel free to pull this up if you have any questions that will pop up during the presentation. For now, I'd like to confront one of the elephants in the room head on. Resident unionization is a tough topic to discuss. To many of us, the topic of unionization is a novel one. Reliable sources of information on unionizing are not readily or easily accessible, especially those focused on the unique challenges that resident physicians face. Additionally, this topic for decades has been essentially a non-starter in discussions with program directors, hospital administration, much like a third rail. Despite these challenges, as I'm sure many of you have noticed, resident unionization has only grown in popularity and occurrence, especially over the past couple of years. Multiple prominent academic medical centers have recently undergone or are currently undergoing unionization efforts with a wide range of reactions from administration and their communities. We feel that no longer is this a topic that's easily avoided. In fact, many proponents promote that unionization may be one of the only existing mechanisms to truly move the needle on safe working conditions, fair pay, and patient safety. We appreciate how confusing this topic can be, and thus this is why we're here before you today. About a year ago, SAEM RAMS, along with EMRA, AAEM RSA, and ACOEP RSO formed a task force to address this as our members were coming to us asking for reliable, objective information on resident unionization that they could trust. I'm proud to say that as a board member on the RAMS for many years, our own resident and medical student members of SAEM, first on the Wellness Committee on a board, recognized how important this was to address. As such, our multi-organizational task force, led by residents, responded and has already delivered a similar presentation back in April at AAEM's Annual Scientific Assembly of 2023. Today's presentation is a continue of our task force mission to make reliable information about unionization readily accessible. Without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to introduce the remainder of the presenters, and when we get to the panel discussion, I'll introduce them as well. Daniel Artiga is a first-year resident at the University of Cincinnati who received his MD from UCLA and his bachelor's in molecular biology at Harvard University. He's an SAEM RAMS member at large and also a dad to a very cute 9-month-old baby who is present at the conference. Not in this room, but I can confirm. Taylor Brown is a second-year emergency medicine resident at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. She completed her undergrad studies at Stanford and medical school at Harvard Medical School. She has served on the SAEM RAMS board as a member at large as well. Her current academic work focuses on resident well-being, including trauma-informed care and trauma-informed learning environments. And lastly, Melinda Kizziah is completing her residency at the Ohio State University, where she will serve as chief resident next year. Additionally, she currently holds the position of past president for ACOEP RSO. When not working, Melinda enjoys traveling, concerts, spending time with her husband and 2 dogs. I want to address briefly how we're going to approach this conversation. Forming a union, as well as refraining from such, is a right protected by federal law. Our task force is not taking a position on whether residents should or should not unionize. However, we do support, as already mentioned, access to reliable and evidence-based resources on unionization. By the end of this presentation, we aim to give you the knowledge and skill set to describe the basic steps of a resident unionization campaign, understand the pros and cons of resident unionization, and analyze the role of unionization in self-advocacy, patient advocacy, and patient safety. We'll start with a brief didactic portion. None of us were super interested in coming and talking at you for an hour or more, so this will be relatively brief and cover some of the basics. Then we'll jump right into a structured panel discussion with important questions partially derived from our members in prior surveys, as well as a brief panel Q&A from questions submitted on the form that is linked via the QR code we've given you. Regarding the didactic portion, we're going to cover the basics. What is a union? How does it work? Who is the NLRB and what's important about them? Some of the logistics, including what a typical pathway looks like and what quote-unquote union busting is. We're going to touch briefly on one of residents' chief concerns about unionization, which is, do they have protections and can they be fired? And lastly, we'll touch very briefly on what does it look like after you vote to be represented by a union. It's honestly not the end goal, it's actually the start of a long journey, electing union representation. So at this time, I'll welcome Taylor Brown up to the podium to start our didactic portion.
Hello. All right, everyone, we are starting with the very, very basics. So what is a union? A union is an organization that represents a group of workers in a particular industry or profession. The primary purpose of a union is to protect its members through collective bargaining with employers over issues such as wages, benefits, and working conditions. Unions can also engage in other kinds of activities like lobbying, advocacy, or education for their members. In general, labor unions are democratic organizations that represent the interests of their members. So members have the right to vote on important decisions such as electing their union leaders, approving contracts, and making policy decisions. It also can be helpful to conceptualize what a union is by talking about how we negotiate when there's not a union in place. So medical residents, fellows, interns, like any other employee, can negotiate directly with their employers, but without any kind of formal organization, their success will vary based on their own level of organization, the size of their institution, policies and the structure and the culture of their institution, and the buy-in from the various stakeholders. And any changes requested by residents are made at the sole discretion of hospital administration or GME. Joining or forming a union can formalize some of that negotiating power. How does it do that? Primarily through collective bargaining. The theory being that as a united front through a union, residents can achieve more than any single resident or a small group of residents could otherwise secure on their own. Unions also offer legal protection, and they can provide legal representation in the event of disputes with an employer. Unions engage in political advocacy, so if there are laws or anything that come up or new legislation that may actually help members, unions can help advocate for that. Another important point is solidarity. Unionized workers have the protected ability to take collective action, such as work stoppages and strikes, which is an incredibly powerful bargaining tool. So through that kind of formalized structure, collective bargaining and legal protections, residents can increase their own bargaining power. How is any of this enforced is where we introduce the National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB. And this is an independent federal agency which is tasked with enforcing the National Labor Relations Act. That's the federal law that grants most private sector employees the right to unionize. So the functions of the NLRB, some of the things that it does, it conducts the elections. So if you've heard of other programs or residents saying they're filing for a union election, it's the NLRB that will actually come and host that election. The NLRB is also in charge of investigating unfair labor practices. They investigate both unions and employers. Some of the issues are things like discrimination, retaliation against employees, or interference with employees' rights to join and form unions. Importantly, the National Labor Relations Board can also adjudicate disputes, so if there's disputes between employees and unions, and it has the authority to enforce their rulings so that employers or unions have to take action to comply with the National Labor Relations Act. So overall, this is a federal agency that does a lot to protect workers' rights. This is another great question. Who is the union? So the union is actually made up of the employees. In our specific context, that would be residents, fellows, interns. Members then go on to elect union leaders and who represent them in contract negotiations. The leadership team advocates for the rights of their members, but at the end of the day, it is the members that retain the ultimate control. There's also union staff, generally in the form of administrative support, attorneys, who can assist in some of the more nuanced legal aspects of it, as well as in contract negotiations. I also wanted to touch briefly on private versus public sector, and it may affect you based on how your hospital is funded. We already mentioned the National Labor Relations Act, the federal law that protects your right to join and form unions as a private sector employee. That law also establishes union election practices. It delineates what unfair labor practices are, and then it also outlines the rights and responsibilities of both employers and unions. In the public sector, it's more confusing. It's governed by a patchwork of state laws and regulations. So there are some states in which public sector employees cannot unionize. In the states that do allow public sector employees to unionize, there are further restrictions. Sometimes only certain sectors can unionize, and then if you do form a union, there may be restrictions around what those unions can negotiate for. So now that we have that background laid, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Artiga to talk through how this might actually come to be.
Let's zoom in. What are the exact steps necessary if a group of residents wants to start a union? First and foremost, residents have to have a cause that unites them together for a union campaign. What benefits are you seeking? What work experiences are you trying to improve? It's a community process and cannot start without a small group of people agreeing on the causes that a union can actually improve. This ends up forming what is called a working group. These are the individual residents who will organize all the formalities of a union election. It's at this point that a national union representation group like CIR could be contacted for assistance. After the working group is formed, building support and campaigning amongst colleagues is the next step. This serves as a temperature check to judge whether there is sufficient support for unionization. This can happen in personal one-on-one conversations or informational sessions. The goal is to determine if a union is electorally viable at your residency site. If the working group believes there is sufficient support, residents sign union cards that prove to the NLRB that the election is viable. The NLRB requires at least 30% of the vote to pass. It's not recommended to file with just that amount, because to achieve actual election, you want a majority, you want a supermajority of signed cards. To be clear, this is not the actual union election vote. The union card authorizes the union election process to take place, but many residents unfortunately do confuse this process. Finally, we reach the point where the NLRB coordinates the union election. A majority is required to elect the union for representation. Residents have the option to elect a large national union to represent them, and this is typically the easier option, and I'll explain why later. They may also elect a self-led independent union. The timeline for these steps requires several years, from recognizing a union is desired to collective bargaining. Since EM residencies are 3 or 4 years long, residents in a working group may not even see the contract benefits to unionization. So often you're doing this for the benefit of future residents or for the benefit of the residency program at that site. With all that said, I'd like to discuss the theoretical harbinger of employer retaliation. To be clear, only the NLRB has access to the union election votes, never the employer. It is expressly illegal to retaliate or threaten punitive actions such as not writing a letter of recommendation for union activities. Employers cannot ask if you support unions or coerce your vote with promised benefits. The simple idea of being fired is frightening enough, though, despite these legal protections, because there's little recourse for physician job opportunities without completing residency. Programs or hospital systems can be antagonistic to unions, but this is not necessarily malicious. It can be priority-driven when the priorities of the organization are not aligned with those of the residents. In these circumstances, it's important to understand what union avoidance or union busting strategies exist and what is illegal and legal. In a completely hypothetical scenario, imagine you're the employer. Again, you cannot fire, threaten, or coerce. So what can you do? One common choice is to hire a union avoidance consultant. These are professional firms that can be hired, and they use a broad range of tactics, from assessing vulnerabilities to unions, providing communication training to respond to union organizing, and preparing and disseminating anti-union materials. This is a large $340 million annual industry. Surveillance and intimidation tactics are firmly illegal, so employers must ensure that hired consultants are working within regulations. Captive audience meetings dissuade employees from voting for unionization on mandatory work time. As long as they do not threaten or coerce, employees can focus on the negative aspects to unionization in these group meetings, such as loss of flexibility, decreased profitability, and so on. There is no legal requirement to include talking points from the pro-union side. Even though employees may feel like it impinges on the ability to make an informed decision, this is not expressly illegal. One-on-one supervisor meetings are similar, however much more intimate. In these settings, vague language can be targeted directly to an employee, and because even though direct threats are illegal, depending on what wording is used, these meetings can hold up in court. So your union won an election and you're unionized now. What does that mean? The collective bargaining process can begin. The employee group will have to agree on their goals for negotiations, and this involves its own decision-making process. But ultimately, you're going to be working with a team of lawyers and negotiators who will then conduct these bargaining sessions where union reps go and negotiate the terms of the contract with the employer. This is why choosing a national union group is the easier option, because they come baked in with the lawyers and negotiating teams. With all that said, I'd like to turn it over to our panel moderators.
Thank you, Dr. Artiga. At this point, I'll have our panel go ahead and come and take your seats. I'm going to put this back up one more time while we're getting set up. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panel. We have an all-star crowd today, people with immense experience in unionization, what the process looks like, all the pros and cons, and they are able and willing to give crucial context to help our attendees better understand this relatively complex issue. I'm going to start by briefly introducing them. We have Lena Carleton, who's a third-year resident, emergency medicine and IM at the University of Illinois, Chicago. During her residency, she became one of the founding members of UIC's Resident Physician Union and has since been involved in bargaining and contract negotiation. She has spoken locally and nationally about her experiences as a union organizer, and her talk, "Organizing is the Best Medicine, the Past, Present, and Future. Resident Unions," won the People's Choice Award of the 2022 EMRA 20 in 6 Resident Lecture Competition. James Blum is another one of our residents, second year in emergency medicine at Boston Medical Center. He did his MD at Mount Sinai and MPP at Harvard Kennedy School. Prior to medical school, he spent 2 years working as a staffer on Capitol Hill, and he is interested in policy and health justice work. Anna Yap is an emergency physician as well as administration and health equity fellow, and this is at UCLA. She currently serves as California Medical Association trustee and as the AMA Resident and Fellows Speaker of the House. Previously, she served as Vice President of CIR. She has used her multidisciplinary background in marketing, education, and community building with medicine to advocate for patients and physicians. She has been an active leader in the labor movement, helping to start a union, advocating for essential workers, as well as authoring and passing legislation to improve the lives of trainees. Hannah Hughes is an assistant professor at University of Cincinnati, where she also completed residency and was a chief resident. She currently serves as the Associate Medical Director of UC's Center for Emergency Care and Interim EM Section Chief at the Cincinnati VA. She graduated from medical school at UCLA and earned her MBA from UCLA's Anderson School of Medicine. She is a past president of EMRA and now serves on the Ohio ACEP Board of Directors. We have Michael Losak, who is a practicing emergency physician and currently assistant professor at Stanford. While he was a resident at University of California, San Francisco, he led the organizing committee that successfully won a new House staff union in 2017, which at the time was the largest new public sector union in California that year, and also thought to be the largest new physician union in union history at the time of its founding. He was subsequently elected to the National Board of CIR, served as a member multiple negotiating committees, and helped a number of other California House staff with their successful organizing campaigns. Since finishing residency, he has stayed involved in the healthcare labor space through writing, advising House staff, organizing committees, and engaging in local politics. Last but not least, we have Dr. David Duong, who's currently interim program director and associate program director at Highlands Hospital's emergency medicine residency program. Dave was one of the union organizers for his attending physicians group, Alameda Health Medical Group, which is the main physician group for Alameda Health System, which includes Highland Hospital, operating in Oakland, California. Welcome to our panel, and thank you all for being here. We're going to aim for one or two kind of pre-prepared answers from our panelist members, and then it will be open for brief discussion if there are any other points to be made before moving on to the next question. All right, we'll go with our first here. Could you describe very briefly what has been your overall experience and involvement in resident unionization or attending unionization as well? And we can start down here.
Yeah, we had a pretty good resume for me beforehand in union negotiating, but I organized UCSF's resident union, which was about 1,450 people. I think it is still the largest new physician union in American history until MGH passes. Yeah, so I'm ready to pass the torch, but I've been involved for a long time and actually helped Dr. Yap with her organizing campaign at UCLA.
That's how we met.
Yep.
So for us, the main thing about physician unionization was physician voice, which we were losing and our administration weren't hearing. Everything from operations, definitely during the pandemic, they didn't hear what we had to say and how we run our emergency departments, how we run our hospitals. And in addition to other things such as retaliation, that really led our physicians to organize and form a physician union.
As mentioned during my introduction, I helped organize the union at University of Illinois Chicago. We are proud to be the first CIR chapter in the Midwest and looking forward to starting the Midwest wave.
So BMC has long had a union. It actually was involved in the 1999 NLRB case that helped establish the right for private teaching hospitals to have unions. I have served as the delegate to the broader hospital group for emergency medicine for 2 years, and am now on the bargaining committee for our new contract.
To clarify, I was regional vice president, not vice president of CIR. Did not get upgraded that high. But got involved my intern year because one of the fourth years in our program knew that I was into organized medicine and health policy and was like, you're somebody who likes grassroots work, and got pulled in that way. During the process, really got involved in the political side, and when we were unable to actually bargain for due process rights and due process protections around professionalism issues, which is something that's in most union contracts across the employee sector and in many resident contracts, we ultimately wrote legislation and passed it. So that was one of the most rewarding things I've done during my residency.
I I probably am the least qualified to be on this panel with the number of people that are up here, but my involvement in unionization was related to my term as EMRA president. So at the time, very beginning, Hahnemann had closed with a number of residents that had been displaced, and there was some significant discussions on a national level of how to protect residents, particularly as it relates to tail coverage and things like that. And so that's where my approach will be in terms of who exists out there to protect residents.
Perfect. So everyone here has kind of a wide range of background and experience. With that experience in mind, why do residents choose to unionize?
I'll kick us off. This is a really important question. Thank you guys for having us and for bringing this out into the open. This is a really important question. I get asked this question a lot. And I think, to be clear, so there was a lot of resident organizing in the 70s, and there was a decision in the 70s by the NLRB to classify us as students and not employees, which blocked a lot of the momentum of this movement. And I think that a lot of this would have happened then and not now, and it was reversed in this 1999 case at BMC. I think since then, Daniel was sort of getting at, you need a cause, you need a reason to organize and to galvanize a lot of people. This is a lot of work for anyone who has tried to organize a union. And so I think that cause, one of the things I want to talk about today, and forgive my panelists who have heard this, but I love these statistics, is a massive shift in the way in which physicians have been employed, especially starting in the 2010s. So the AMA put out this really interesting study in 2012 that showed that 60%, at that time, 60% of physician labor was physician-owned. When they repeated that study in 2020, a few months into COVID, less than half of physician labor was physician-owned, and an estimate from the Physician Advocacy Institute in 2022 now estimates that almost 75% of physician labor is owned by a hospital or corporate system. So I name all that data mostly to emphasize that we are not small business owners anymore, and we do not control our labor, and that has very serious ramifications for the power in which we have at work, like Dr. Duong was talking about. And this has led, I think nothing has been more clear that we lack that power than being shift workers, being residents, and then COVID. And I think that that's really accelerated the trend of people feeling the need to reclaim physician voice and power in this system, to advocate for ourselves and to advocate for our patients. A reminder that our work conditions are patient care conditions, and that's why a lot of people, I think, are organizing.
I'm going to sort of pick up on what both Dr. Duong and Dr. Losak were saying with respect to having a voice. I think this is a large driver of resident unionization. Of course, we all have a voice in being able to, voice our opinions, but in terms of having a voice that is unified, site-specific, and powerful, there's currently no other infrastructure in place that gives residents the ability to voice their concerns and have power behind that in order to affect change, both within an individual residency program and in an institution. Other mechanisms that have been proposed are sort of just going to your program director and asking them to advocate on your behalf, which can be effective for an individual issue. There's a lot of GME, councils and things like that, but those are not necessarily representative of the entire resident and fellow body, and they also do not come with any sort of power. Lastly, there are amazing organizations that support residents and fellows across the country, many of whom are involved in coordinating this panel. Unfortunately, those are not always able to address issues at a specific site. So really, a union gives a unique set of tools to address issues by giving residents a unified, site-specific, and powerful voice.
Not to mention, we know residents are a specifically vulnerable population where you must finish your residency in order to be able to practice as attendings. And because of the match, because of the exemption from antitrust issues, we don't get to negotiate our salary. We don't get to do normal negotiations. And so I think that has also brought forward why residents are so interested in finding unionization as a solution to that particular problem. Because we could talk about maybe doing away with the match or somehow fixing it or dealing with antitrust issues, but there are many issues with doing that as well. So I think that's why unionization has also come forward as a solution to the negotiating power.
Which problems facing resident physicians do you feel that unions are best suited or most uniquely able to address?
So residents are specifically both learners and workers, and we have the ACGME to target the learner aspect, but we don't really have anybody to protect us when it comes to that worker aspect. And that's really where the unions have come forward and say, we are going to tackle your employee and worker issues. That's why when we wrote the law in California that gives us due process protections, it was specifically only for professionalism issues and issues dealing with your employee part. We as residents have due process protections around academic issues, but not around that employee side. There's also other things that we can get benefits for, right? Salary, of course, but also parental leave, sick pay, retirement, all these other aspects that we don't necessarily think about, and for a long time we're like, we're not necessarily workers, but as we're becoming more and more employees and workers, I think we're becoming more aware of how important it is to think about these things. At UCLA, one of the reasons why we unionized, there were multiple reasons, but one of them was actually they actually took away our fertility benefits. And we weren't able to negotiate it back into our first contract, but actually in this last contract, with the power of multiple University of California campuses coming together, they were able to negotiate a single University of California contract that actually brings back fertility benefits for residents and leading the country in that.
Yeah, so I think I'll reiterate two points that were made, that the problem in general with residents, and not emergency medicine specific, is that there's truly no body that exists to protect residents. People often cite the ACGME as that protective mechanism, right? Because you think about hours violations and things like that. But if you look at what the ACGME's mission is, it's actually to protect the public. It's to protect the public from learners. And so when you have an issue related to residents, there's no specific entity that can step up to protect those residents. Lena mentioned, yes, there's EMRA and RAMS and all these different organizations, but their power to protect on a national level from a lobbyist standpoint does not exist. So I think when you talk about why unionize, or what benefits can you get from, it's probably helpful to talk about what you don't get. And I think Lena has mentioned a number of times that unions are often site specific. That's helpful if you're having an issue within your hospital system, but does not address larger scale issues that, like Anna mentioned, which are the antitrust components of the match, or the fact that you can have a hospital go bankrupt and you are displaced from your job with no feasible way to match into another job, and then from that you have no tail coverage. So I think that the mechanism of which that steps in today is probably the AMA, because you're talking about multiple specialties, but they don't have the same necessary mission to protect residents directly. So it's that absence that unionization has started to occur, but I don't think that you can get into specialty-specific issues with unionization, and you can't get to national solutions with unionization. Those are the two big drawbacks.
Yeah, definitely the Hahnemann situation has brought forward unionization and the whole concern about protections of residents forefront at the AMA. I was actually on the governing council as an intern or second year when that happened. And there were the issues around Hahnemann trying to sell the residency positions and having so many residents displaced. And the AMA did step in to a degree and with the Pennsylvania Medical Association come up with money to help pay for tail coverage, but that's not a viable solution.
That's patchwork.
Yeah, it's not real.
So through this presentation and the panel discussion so far, we've talked a lot about the benefits, the ability to have that voice and that protection for residents. On the flip side, are there potential harms to residents from unionization, and why might they opt to not unionize?
So I'm probably trying to represent a more neutral representation of whether you should or should not unionize. I will say that I trained at an institution that was very responsive to resident feedback. So I think that the harms of unionization are, if you have a great working relationship with your hospital administration and your DIO, there may not be a need. It's not that there's necessarily a harm, but you may not have a need. I think that is becoming fewer and fewer in terms of examples that exist out there. I happen to be at an institution where I would say that was the case. So a couple of years into my residency, there were whispers of unionization at our institution, and we actually did not make it to the point of being able to hold an election because there was not enough signatures in place, because it was felt that the need wasn't there. based on our current situation.
In Los Angeles, Cedars-Sinai is a perfect example of making sure that they make the salaries and everything else good enough so that their residents don't unionize compared to all the other programs in Los Angeles. And while that is nice and great, none of it is set in stone. But I will say that if you don't have the organizing team and that support there at that base level, you are setting yourself up for failure, and that can be very difficult. I don't know if folks have been following what has been happening at Loma Linda. If that happened during the Trump era, it possibly could have had a similar ruling back in the 70s when calling residents students. That could possibly happen again. Depending on the makeup of the NLRB, who is appointed by the president, so oftentimes changes based on political party, you can have a union-friendly or union-unfriendly NLRB. So during the Trump era, there were actually quite a few private institutions that did ask CIR, we want to unionize, but CIR had to say, this is not a good time. You could threaten the ability for residents nationwide to unionize. So there can be political ramifications of your program or your place unionizing, in addition to the fact that there are states like North Carolina where public sector employees, residents cannot unionize, and so that's just not even a feasible opportunity. There's also, unfortunately, the stigma, especially in more hierarchical specialties, surgery being kind of the most common one that we saw, where unfortunately attendings can be quite negative on unionizing. And at our site, we didn't have a lot of surgery residents be vocal supporters. They were members, and you don't have to tell your attendings you're a member, you pay your dues and that's just it. And they would rely on us in more friendly specialties, emergency medicine tending to be one, seeing as most all of us are employees, even as attendings, to kind of speak up for other residents. But unfortunately, you can't necessarily protect against the soft retaliation that can happen. You can have one of your supervisors who maybe doesn't like you so much and won't promote you up the ranks, and they don't say it's because you're pro-union, but they can say things like, oh, you're not so committed to the residency. You're not so XYZ things because you're a union person, but they don't say that last bit.
What can you say about the impact of resident unionization on moonlighting opportunities, especially in the context of it being a major criticism, right? That administration might come to a group that is thinking about unionizing and say, this might severely restrict your ability to moonlight.
Sure. I guess I would first say, one, that statements like that can often be used as scare tactics to prevent residents from taking their own power. And then two, I would just hit on two key themes. The first is that a contract serves as a floor, not a ceiling for what you can do. And so programs and different departments can go above and beyond that if they want to. And then the second theme is that the union can help facilitate conversations with the administration that otherwise they might be inclined to ignore. At BMC, we had not been able to moonlight in our department, and we recently changed this last year with the support of the union. So it's kind of been the opposite of fears that you might hear.
For us at UIC, it was more about putting the moonlighting opportunities that we already had through individual departments into a contract so that they could not be unilaterally changed. So if administration, overnight decided that they did not want us to moonlight at a particular site or wanted to change the rate, that would be something that would need to go to the bargaining table and be up for negotiation, as opposed to prior to unionization when they could just make that change without any resident or fellow input.
To change this floor versus ceiling kind of conversation, I will say as part of the negatives conversation, unfortunately labor relations and administration will oftentimes try to call it a ceiling. And so if your department or your organizing committee doesn't do a good job of making sure they figure out what all the benefits were in every specialty and write that into your contract, that can be missed. And that is a real risk, and that does happen. And unfortunately, it's going to happen anyway. We are seeing that administration is oftentimes trying to take away benefits and things that are given to us. But when you are organizing, be very aware that that is indeed the case.
So if a residency is unionized, can the administration still do things such as adjust the format of training programs, provide bonuses, and other incentives?
This is a really interesting and complicated question, so I'll try to cover it. I think to help think about it, we should acknowledge two theoretical frameworks. One is that a union is just made up of its members that are democratically elected, and your contract is just whatever they decide and agree upon with your employer. So you can put theoretically anything you want in that contract. If you can convince the rest of the hospital that the EM residents deserve $50,000 more than everyone else, like, sure, like you can do whatever you want. I think the second is that to think about like the stages of this. So either you don't have a union, you have a union, you're pre-contract, or you're under contract. And those are sort of 3 time points to think about this. One is before you have a union, like, yeah, you can do whatever you want, and so can the employer. And that they could give you money, or they could take it away, or they could take away your benefits, or they could give you something else. I mean, I think that's dependent upon the like goodwill and overall relationship that you have with your employer. Once you're under contract, yes, if they're going to give you a bonus, does that need to go through the union? It does. I think that this is often, again, another like scare tactics that's brought up, that once we're under status quo, we can't actually give you anything. And that's not true. They just have to run it by the union and get approval. And I don't know any group of residents that would not authorize a raise being offered to them voluntarily. So I think that to keep in mind, but it does need to go through the union and be agreed upon, who is you. And then once you start thinking about that contract negotiation, you actually tally up all the benefits that you have in every department and use that as the floor off of which to negotiate, like we were talking about earlier. So radiology got fancy computers at UCSF, and pathology actually made more than us. And so we went through and found out what everyone made voluntarily, and then set that as the floor and negotiated off of that. So you are streamlining your contract, but you are trying to bring it to the highest point and then build off of that. We didn't really get into curricula-based things. Like this is a high-level contract meant to cover all residents. One of the things that comes up a lot is duty hours. And so our surgical residents asked us not to negotiate about these because they felt it benefited them to be able to have 30 hours. So we didn't get into it, again, because they asked us not to. And then once you have a contract, you can, if they all of a sudden want to give you a bonus because it's an extraordinary time like COVID, you can still have a meet and confer. You can meet with labor relations, and they could give you that money. Again, I don't think a union is going to say, please don't give our members more money. And so you can have that discussion outside of the contract, even if that idea is covered, like that benefit is covered by the purview of the contract you've already negotiated. So that's like the general structure that I think about in approaching this question.
And just to jump off of the quick bonus point, no, most hospitals were not willing to give residents bonuses, and in fact, we're giving bonuses to nurses and like everybody else except us. And in many unionized shops, the union was actually able to be like, hey, why are you giving everybody else bonuses and not us? So that was actually somewhere where the union actually made sure that we had equity with the rest of the hospital.
And actually, we saw that in our physician group, because nurses and residents in our hospitals, they got a COVID bonus, they got COVID leave, and the ununionized physicians did not. In terms of the training format, I'm just speaking more from a program director hat, is, if you could make a case that a training format adversely affects your working conditions or adversely affects patient care, then you could make a case for that. But in general, resident unions don't affect how a residency, the residency curriculum. So in other words, rotations, again, length. You might be able to make some case, but in general, the curriculum of emergency medicine training programs are pretty standard and pretty uniform, that it's going to be a harder case to make. And so my residents, when they do negotiate, it's more on things like making sure duty hours are under effect. But again, like the AC, which Hannah I think is a great kind of point, is that ACGME is to protect the public. And sometimes I even kind of forget that because how I think about duty hours. But usually that is under that's the responsibility of your GME and your residency office. And then the union can come in if you're saying, hey, the GME and residency leadership are not doing anything about it.
Yeah, not to mention there's a direct conflict of interest. Why would a resident want to report things to the ACGME, get their program closed down, and then they have nowhere to go and they can't finish residency? So there's that inherent conflict with the ACGME being this supposed watershed for residents to be able to go to when there's issues around their employee workforce.
I think the only piece that wasn't mentioned is if inherently the union is negotiating on your behalf, which means negotiations, right? And most of the issues that residents are bringing up to the table are those that are distributive. I want more money, I want more time, et cetera. It's not necessarily an integrative negotiation. And so there is one program that did have the union, the hospital went to the union for COVID bonuses. The union negotiated probably too hard and was trying to get more than what was being offered. And so then the hospital said, okay, we're not doing it at all. And so that is a potential, there's still a negotiation that occurs even in those institutions. And so you have to understand there's some basic business mechanics there. And that's why your union representation really does matter when it comes to those decisions.
What is the impact of resident unionization in your experience on department-specific benefits? And for example, this may or may not be hypothetical. If a department, an unnamed department, were, prior to a unionization drive, offering an overtime resident pay rate within a specific department, for example, if you're staying past 5 p.m., you're offered $100 per hour, almost like a moonlighting fee when you go past 5. Are things like that at direct or indirect risk of elimination during the unionization process?
So I think we've already kind of talked about this some. Again, I would think about the contract as a floor, not a ceiling, and seek to include this stuff into the contract. I would give one specific example at BMC is we, through our contract, have professional education funding. But then also through the Department of Emergency Medicine, we get additional funding to come to conferences such as this. And so all of those things are definitely possible.
Yeah, other things about impact that residents can make at a department level, and this really speaks to why you went into medicine in the first place, and quite frankly, how the public, how the hospital sees you, because optics kind of matter, but our residents, they were able to increase their patient care funds. What that means, like they were able to send home our patients during COVID with portable oxygen sensors, which then administrators like, oh my God, this is a great idea, let's do this. So they put more money into that. They were able to use these funds to establish other health inequities. Other things too, diversity scholarships. They were able to help with increasing diversity scholarships for medical students and other diversity initiatives. So that is all resident union led that has definitely benefited the department and quite frankly put a more positive light from attending physicians on resident unions and residents in unions. So those are some of the things I say that have really impacted at a department level in addition to education conference funds.
Yeah. Also, we've seen that your program leadership can also in some ways leverage the power of the union, because your program leadership also only has so much strength when trying to deal with GME. They don't get to have power over your salary. They don't get to have power over many things that come as you as employees. And so sometimes, I had program leadership be like, hey, we're having this issue. Union interested in it? And we tackled it. So there are benefits if you have a friendly administration and a friendly relationship there.
I just want to note we're going to be continuing with this structured panel for approximately 12 more minutes, and we have a couple more questions to get through, so we can try to tighten those up so we have time for the live Q&A. Our next question is, and this is something that we haven't touched too much about, a little bit, what benefits can our patients realize from residents unionizing? And why is that important to residents wanting or not wanting to unionize in the first place?
Yeah. I think this is really important to cover. I think often this is presented as, if you're trying to form a union, this might be to the detriment of patients, and I don't think anything could be further from the truth. First off, obviously, when residents and physicians and workers in general are well rested and well paid, they're going to be providing better care. And then I think other things that people might not know is like Dr. Duong mentioned, in our contract, we have a patient care fund. For example, we use this to secure specific carts and beds in our department to facilitate pelvic exams, which we previously did not have. We also, in our contract, have language around ancillary services and, how often phlebotomy needs to come by, and things that help improve patient care generally. And then 3, which I think we briefly touched on, is really trying to improve the diversity of the residents who are providing care. And I think, having a group of residents and physicians that look like the patients they're serving and have shared life experiences is really important. We have money for that in our contract, and it's something we're also fighting for in our new contract too.
And I just want to briefly ground us historically, because I didn't know these things before I started doing organizing work. The resident strikes of the 70s, one in New York and one in LA, established the one in New York established the first ever meaningful limits on call and duty hours. So that definitely protects our patients. And the one in LA massively increased their patient care fund. That's what they were striking for. So I think very direct labor actions have led to the establishment of patient protections in those cases.
We've talked a lot about kind of hypothetical situations, things you may run into, but in your experience, how has administration responded to unionization efforts and your involvement?
So my direct program leadership has always been supportive and great, and so there's never any problems there. And at the end of the day, like Michael likes to say this when we do our other panels, but really unionization is between residents and their employers up on high, not your faculty or people right above you. And so it, in terms of relationship, working day, all that, it's been fine.
I had a very positive experience at my institution. As a dual trainee, I have a home in the EM program, the IM program, and then also the EM-IM program. I think, I came in with the same values in terms of social justice and equity. And all of my actions in terms of helping form the union and contract negotiation were in line with that. So before we went public, I sat down with my program director and said, hey, you're gonna see my face on a few posters around the hospital. Don't be surprised. And he wasn't. This is totally consistent with everything else that I've done. And I sort of laid out what some of our reasons were for wanting to organize a union, and also how I hoped that forming a union would help our residency program as a whole. As Dr. Yap was saying, it really can be to the benefit of program directors to leverage the power of the union, because there are so many benefits that are beyond their capacity, and systems-wide issues that are beyond their capacity. And it's been a good experience.
What has your experience been in captive audience meetings? And just to remind our audience, these are sessions where employers have you come to mandatory meetings on work time, where they can set restrictions on the types of questions you ask, and they typically give a rather one-sided view, typically the cons, without even addressing the pros of unionization. So have y'all experienced these, and if not, have you heard of them, and how do residents typically respond?
So personally at UCLA, I did not, because they ended up voluntarily recognizing us because UCSF did a great job and had an overwhelming vote, and so they're like, let's not even try. But we've seen residents across the country, especially like MGH, put up their screenshots from their wacky captive audience meetings that have just pure falsities, and residents have been able to laugh at it. But it has been very frustrating. I've heard residents who say that they've been pulled in during their academic conference time. They're being sat down and told about how a union is terrible, and it's been frustrating for them. But they've seen that for folks who are really interested in unionizing, they've been able to see through it, and I think has in fact done the opposite and really gotten people to say, yeah, definitely let's unionize. They're wasting this much money to get us not to do it.
Similarly at UIC, we did not have any captive audience meetings. We did see a lot of other tactics, both sort of carrot and stick. And as part of the organizing committee, it was our job to sort of provide some anticipatory guidance to the residents as some of these initiatives were being rolled out. So saying, hey, we're putting a little bit more pressure on administration right now. Don't be surprised if they threaten to take away this benefit, or if all of a sudden they're offering this other new benefit as a way to try to dissuade us from organizing a union. So I think being proactive in these situations, and telling folks what they can expect and what appropriate ways to respond might be can be a strategy for handling these types of meetings.
Great. This next question I think is an important one, and I'm also going to combine it with one of the submitted questions regarding the massive raises that we've seen for folks at MGB, which included most recently after the public kind of facing nature of their union campaign, where they got a 10% immediate raise, $10,000 housing stipend, which none of the Harvard programs had in Boston, as well as new retirement benefits, which included a contribution not requiring, any matching or, investment by the residents themselves. So this question specifically is, admin finds out, just like MGB, they give you a large bonus or raise. With your knowledge base, what does this mean? And is this many residents may say, well, this is a reason not to unionize. They're responding to our concerns. How do you interpret it? And if you've encountered this, what have residents reacted with?
My number one question when that happens is asking them, why did it take you threatening to strike for your hospital to care about you to do that, right? When you don't have a union, none of that is set in stone. It can be taken away immediately once the folks who are interested in unionizing go away. And also, when you unionize, your negotiating team is never going to settle for less than what you get. So if anything, them offering these things is now sending you in even a higher basement from where your negotiating committee is going to bargain from.
And that's what we're seeing with our physician union. They gave us all a nice raise, and we're in negotiation now, and they're taking it away. Anything they give you, they can take away. So we got a COLA. Now they don't want to give us a COLA. Now they want to give a certain amount of parental leave. Now in negotiations, now they want to retract it. So imagine if we didn't have a union, what they could do. It is at the whim of the employer. So that is something that absolutely, I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you on.
Great. So we're moving closer to the threshold we will need to move over to our live Q&A list. I want to tackle one more question here, which hasn't necessarily been addressed yet. Can we talk briefly about union dues? Are they, corporate unions trying to make a buck off your back and manipulating you? What are union dues? What are they for? What do they really mean?
So when you are unionizing, before you have a contract, all of the work that's being done by the union is for free. So right now, all the work that CIR is doing at MGH is from the dues that other residents and other unions are paying in. And union dues are not collected until you have your negotiated contract. So that is number one, what those dues are for, but also the dues are used to pay for your staff and to pay for your lawyers and to pay for everybody who keeps on keeping the union going.
Yeah, I'll just say before this panel, I looked up my contribution per paycheck. It was $40. I think that's a steal for what you get from having a union. Right now in negotiations, we have our lawyer who professionally negotiates contracts and has been immensely helpful. And I think that's just one of many things that you get from the dues, and they're not onerous at all.
I love this question because it came up all the time when I was organizing. I know I've met a bunch of the staff that works here, and I would love for them to be fabulously wealthy, but they're not in it for the money. So this money is going back to us, the members. And I think that something to keep in mind, the budget is voted on by the membership and their elected delegates. So all of this is under your power and control. And then that budget and that spending is public. It's required to be public by the federal government. They have to file an LM2 annually, and you can Google it. Like if you want to Google the Committee of Interns and Residents and their form, it'll come up right now, and you can look up people's salaries and how they spent their money. So all of this information is public and under your control, and ultimately, therefore, is mostly coming back to benefit you through contract enforcement and organizing.
Just one other thing that comes up is your union dues do not go towards political activities. Those are through separate funds that you can choose to give to. So for example, I also choose to make contributions to CIR's political committee, but that's not what your base dues go towards.
And I believe dues are either 1.4% or 1.6%, and as a background, we got a 12% raise when we negotiated our first contract. So it more than makes up for any dues that are typically obtained.
It is a little bit different outside of CIR for dues in terms of political use for that. And so some of the money that is that comes from dues for other unions can go, especially for very large unions, can go for other union efforts. Because, for instance, we're with SEIU, which also supports nurses, not only healthcare worker, service industry, and so it goes towards larger efforts as well too. Again, it's all public, so we can kind of see what it's going towards, and then people decide whether it's worth it to them or whether they agree.
One thing that's not mentioned is when you have a well-established union, right? Because we're talking about this in the context of residents, but for instance, on my job on the VA side, the VA has had unions for physicians for years. And so then you get into the question of whether you choose to pay union dues or not, even though you're going to benefit from the union. And so there's a little bit of that market tension that can happen when you are not talking about the initial unionization component, but rather sustaining a union and then depending on the end, right? So I think a component of this that we've not mentioned at all in this conversation is it really depends on who your employer is, right? All of this is irrelevant if your employer files for bankruptcy. Envision? Anybody? Right? So when you're talking about private equity and bankruptcy and a union cannot necessarily protect against that. And that was some of the issues that we were talking about with the Hahnemann closure specifically, is that all of those residents, had they had a union, still would have had the same exact outcome as they had today. So it's just understanding the limitations of what that union has. It is not going to save your hospital from going bankrupt, of which the majority of hospitals right now are in the red. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're talking about dues and what they protect you against.
Perfect, thank you. In the interest of time, we are going to transition to the Q&A submitted during the presentation today. The first question coming in from the audience is, why can't resident unions strike? Do you think that this is right? And what other mechanisms are in place for resident unions to bargain?
Resident unions can strike. I'll just get that out there now. But I'll start with the second half of the question, which is what other mechanisms are in place to leverage your negotiating power. There's sort of a scale of actions that a resident union can take in order to put pressure on administration. This ranges from, sort of site-specific things like a show of support, everybody wearing buttons or shirts or something like that on a particular day, and can sort of escalate to media campaigns that are a bit more public-facing, right, using public support or maybe even a little bit of shame to leverage the power of the union towards your negotiating goals. Stepping up from that would be something like a unity break. This is a coordinated break that workers can take at the same time. It is not a strike. You are just all taking a break at the same time as a show of what your workforce looks like, both on site and maybe away from your work site for a brief period of time. Often there's a media component to that as well as some specific items that you're hoping to achieve. And then, the ultimate tool of a union is to withhold the labor of its members, and that is called a strike. Resident unions absolutely can strike. Again, this is not the first tactic that is used. Usually there's a scaling up, and there are certain rules in place for how residents can strike and how healthcare employees can strike, given that our jobs are dealing with issues of life and death. So there's a certain notice period that you're required to give, hopefully with the idea that within that notice period, some hardcore negotiating can happen to try to avert the work stoppage.
And also in the strike, there is maintenance of essential services that's written into what we can do. And I think where the confusion comes in is actually the AMA Code of Ethics says physicians should not strike. There's whisperings of people wanting to have them revisit that and think about it. But we are technically allowed to strike assuming you haven't written that into your contract. So many resident contracts will say if you are under contract, you will not strike. But once you are out of contract and you're negotiating, you're coming to an impasse, then we're allowed to strike.
Core within us is this, we do not want to abandon our patients. And just thinking about striking and equating to that it's not actually the case. It may feel that way, and you can make this logical leap, there, but there's a lot of planning that comes into place. It's not like, oh, we're gonna strike tomorrow and we're just gonna leave our patient while we're just taking a history. That's not what's happening. We are doing this in 2 weeks. This is what's gonna happen in terms of planning, essential services. There are people that can, quote unquote, jump the line. Or for instance, in the emergency department, we'll have people that say, yes, we'll still staff the emergency department, but outpatient clinics we won't, or different ways to do a strike. But I think that is such a huge tool within unions that to just get familiar with it and start to get used to it, it may not feel good to you right now, but to start thinking a little bit more about, well, how can you do that without abandoning your patient and not thinking about the same thing is something to consider, because it is a huge, powerful tool. Other things to consider too, and it doesn't happen in all structures, is what about if I don't bill? What if I don't sign the chart? So withhold money from the institution as a way of striking, as opposed to leaving service. So there's different ways to go about withholding your labor.
I think to get over the fact that you feel the negativity of striking, that's where the common misconception is that you cannot strike. Really, you should take it a step back and say, if I was a trainee and not part of the workforce, my hospital could theoretically go throughout an entire day without me needing to be there because I am being trained. I am not a work member, right? And so by giving them notice, you have allowed them ample opportunity to provide the necessary staffing to maintain hospital operations and patient safety while you then are striking for your own benefit. So I think that that's the acknowledgement, this discontent of trainee versus workforce, and we are getting on the latter side of workforce in a lot of places in the country, and that's where I think that's where unionization has to happen the most. And so acknowledge that you are a trainee too, and thus they should not rely on you to get patient care done.
I also this often gets framed as residents are choosing to strike or they're abandoning patients, but at the same time, it's also true that if the hospital wanted to avoid a strike, they could do so immediately, right? They just have to agree to the negotiation. And so this is also just as much on the hospital and how they're abandoning their patients too. And it's important to keep that perspective in mind also.
You also, just to name, you need a really high degree of agreement to have a strike. So like the traditional thinking is you need more than 90% of your staff to want to strike to be able to even effectively strike. So if 90% of your workforce is thinking about striking, that's like a high level of agreement across a lot of services at your group, just to name that as part of the process and as the end step of a process of a long negotiating period. And I think Lena did a really nice job outlining all the things you do up until that point.
Yeah, so we're going to move to a kind of speed round. So we'll stick to one answer for the next couple questions to move through a couple points. What can program directors and attendings do to support residents? What does that look like, and how can they help move the needle and facilitate?
One easy over there.
Not targeted.
It is tough. So inadvertently, I walked in on a meeting because I just didn't know that I wasn't supposed to be at a resident union negotiation, and then, the administration told me, had a word with me, and then I got a letter email from the CEO that I was, almost like a cease and desist kind of email. So formally, program directors can't be at the bargaining table, at least where in our state or where we are there. But there's other things we can do to support. Like I give them time. So at the end of conference, okay, it's residency steering. Maybe I'll just, hey, why don't you guys take this? You guys sounds like there's a lot you would need to talk about, to organize, or to discuss next steps. How about if I give you that time so you all have it together? So there's different ways I can kind of do it with kind of taking a step back. That's one thing that comes out of to mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so frequently hospitals justify low wages and compensation benefits due to the cost of maintaining a residency program despite CMS funding. Is there actual data or fact to support that residents are net cost versus benefit? And if benefit, how much are they worth generally?
That is specialty specific.
Yeah, this is a big discussion, and I have reviewed this data previously. I don't think it's particularly strong, but I also don't remember it off the top of my head. And there's also this question over whether APPs are therefore like less expensive, and I think that's the debate. There's not to my knowledge, not a really good head-to-head study that describes that, and they'll say that residents are more expensive. But like, just to give you hard numbers, so when we were looking at this from UCSF, CMS gave UCSF $125,000 per resident per year, and they only have to account for a third of that in direct funding to your salary. The other 2/3 is sort of up to them. And then we were working 20 shifts, and then they were also paying us like $70,000. So there was a big gap for us when we presented the economics of where the rest of that money was, and even if we were expensive, if we were executing labor for the hospital, like, weren't we also making money despite having a single supervisor in a model? And so it's a great question. I don't know that there's that there's data I can point to. I can look for it, but I don't know if you guys know of any.
Where Hannah was saying it's specialty specific, we've seen in our specialty you have for-profit institutions making residencies sans CMS funding and are financially viable. So in our specialty, we make money for the institution, but in other specialties that is not necessarily the case. So unfortunately, that data is pretty difficult to figure out there.
We would not have the rise in emergency medicine residencies that we have had over the last couple of years if it was not financially incentivizing to the people that are creating them. That is not true of every specialty, though. We bill procedurally, and that's one of the main tipping points of whether or not you bring in money or cost money to a hospital system if you're making generalizations.
So what I'm hearing is it's a complicated issue, and there's no consensus that residents are money losers. For those attendees who might be worried about the more subtle forms of discrimination and retaliation, like the evals, as mentioned, Anna, you're talking about that, well, they just don't say that it's because of the unionization component. What would you say to residents about those concerns, and how can that be, modulated or protected against?
I think it can be both ways. Like at my program, I was seen as a protector and a fighter for both our residents and our faculty, and well respected as a result. And I think in emergency medicine, you're going to see that being the case in general, because there's a lot of things that we can translate into our practice further moving on. So I'd say for us in the room here, that is not something you have to worry so much about. But I have a friend who's a big organizer who's in internal medicine and didn't get their chief position and found out that their PD actually is pretty anti-union and didn't realize that until after all this. And it sucks, and it's a reality situation. I think you just have to kind of know where you're working at and kind of suss that out.
Now, is that a risk for like if they're not involved in unionization effort and they're just a voter? I mean, is that something to be worried about?
No, because
It's not public.
Yeah, it's not public. Like your faculty, nobody has to know if you're a union member or not. So.
We all just chose to be public-facing, to give people, kernels to organize around, and because we thought, I think many of us have staked our reputation and time on thinking that this is the right thing to do for our residents and for our patients, and so chose to be very public as an access point and as like a knowledge point for our organizing campaigns.
It's because I could be visible that I said I'm going to do it for those who can't, and it's a matter of equity.
And I think, the same administrator or leader in the department who feels negatively about unions is going to feel similarly about any effort to improve conditions. And so you might as well have a union at your back where everybody's involved.
All right, I think this will be our last question due to the time constraint. But how does one go about building a coalition to unionize at a large hospital system with many different sites and programs in different specialties?
I can speak to this, and then I'll add on the back end of that during a pandemic, because that's how we organized at UIC. UIC has a vast number. We have about 800 residents and fellows, and we rotate at a variety of hospitals throughout the city and also even in different counties in Illinois. And for us, it was really about establishing representation within each specialty and each residency program, and sort of having a point person there who's able to both gauge the temperature of that individual residency program, bring issues from that program to the larger organizing committee, and then disseminate information as well. The more residents that you have involved, residents and fellows that are representative of the entire resident and fellow population at your institution, the better you're going to do in terms of both information gathering, as we were mentioning, talking about benefits that are differential across different programs, and the better you're going to do in terms of
advocating for policies and benefits that benefit everybody. So I would say, that representation across all the different specialties and having that point person can really help bring a unionization campaign together.
And the way to maintain that longevity and strength, and the thing that I always teach people is how to be a good leader and to make sure that your grassroots work continues, is that you should build a culture where if you've decided you're going to be the leader in your specialty, then as you're leaving, or that year before you're leaving, you identify others behind you who are going to fill your spot. And building that culture to make sure that there's always somebody coming from behind to continue the work is incredibly important to ensuring that your union is successful and strong for years to come.
Thank you to all our attendees for coming. Can we have a round of applause for our panel? Thanks, everyone.